Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday. I'm waiting for Wednesday.
Hey boys and girls, it's Mr. Pete with the Wednesday Wars. Today we are going to start March after a pretty exciting February where we had a successful date to see Romeo and Juliet and to go to Woolworths. We had the competition coming to fruition between Hood and Associates and Kowalski and Associates. The one in which Kowalski and Associates stole the idea from Marilee, who Holling thought stole the idea from him. Turned out that Mr. Kowalski stole the idea from Marilee, used it, and then because she was so upset and because they weren't on speaking terms, she came in with those sunglasses on and was crying almost the entire week. Her dad did the right thing and turned down the job. Of course, Holling's dad takes advantage of that and rips on Kowalski and Associates and basically says if it would have been opposite, he would have just cheated and won. So you can see that Mr. Kowalski made a mistake and then made it better, whereas Mr. Hood keeps making mistakes. So that seems to be the kind of thing, like Mr. Kowalski seems to be doing the same sort of thing that Holling's been doing throughout this story. You know, he makes mistakes, but he's slowly but surely starting to figure out how things work beyond just him. All right, let's jump into March and find out what happens next, because the Ides of March are upon us. The news from Khe Sanh that Walter Cronkite reported each night kept getting grimmer. The 5,000 Marines there were cut off and could get supplies only by air, even though any helicopter that flew over took a lot of enemy fire from the 20,000 surrounding Viet Cong troops.
The date is January 1968. A remote United States garrison located in the Khe Sanh district of South Vietnam, known as the Khe Sanh Combat Base or Hill 861A, is caught in the middle of a North Vietnamese invasion of the area. February 23rd marked the heaviest bombardment of the battle, with 1,307 North Vietnamese rounds hitting the base over a period of 8 hours. At the end of the day, 10 U.S. soldiers were dead and 51 others wounded. In addition, it was discovered that NVA troops had been building forward logistics bases within a few thousand meters of the base's south perimeter. Even worse, a series of shallow enemy trenches were being dug that ran parallel to the base's fences. However, through ground and aerial observers, photo reconnaissance, and infrared imagery, the locations of North Vietnamese operating bases were pinpointed and destroyed from aerial strikes. Again, the success of the Marines wouldn't last. On February 25th, a platoon from the 26th Regiment was ambushed in a short patrol outside of the base's southern perimeter. After pursuing 3 enemy scouts, the group was ambushed by Vietnamese in an entrenched, crescent-shaped formation, and 30 Marines ended up dead or missing. Heavy artillery shelling continued throughout March, despite an observed departure of many NVA troops from the Khe Sanh area. On the 30th, the Bravo Company of the 26th launched an attack on the compound in which their allies were ambushed nearly 1 month ago. Approaching alongside mortar shelling and under the cover of heavy mist, the Marines, led by Captain Ken Pipes, set upon the Vietnamese with flamethrowers and small arms, killing 115 of the enemy in a devastating surprise attack. This, however, was the last significant encounter of Operation Scotland, with it being terminated on the 31st. The Battle of Khe Sanh effectively was over, and relief efforts for the base began on April 1st with Operation Pegasus.
Meanwhile, the Marines were dug into bunkers covered with 3 feet of earth to protect them from the mortar shells that the Viet Cong were lobbing into camp. About 500 mortar shells a day. And when they weren't lobbing shells, the Viet Cong were digging tunnels that they could use to put explosives beneath the Marines. Some reports said that the tunnels were only 100 yards away from the barbed wire around the Khe Sanh base. The Marines had started to use stethoscopes and divining rods to see if they could find them. You know things are bad when the United States Marine Corps is using stethoscopes and divining rods. Still, the White House announced that the enemy offensive was running out of steam, that casualties at Khe Sanh were light, that we would never give up the Marine base there. We watched Walter Cronkite together every night after supper now, even my sister. We were all quiet, and not just because my father would have hollered if anyone had interrupted Walter Cronkite. Sometimes, though, my father himself would shake his head and whisper, 5,000 boys trapped. Good Lord, 5,000. We'd watch the pictures of the Marines in their zigzagging trenches, or deep in their bunkers, holding their hands over their ears inside their helmets because of the thunder of the mortar shells. Then my father would reach for my mother's hand, and they would look at each other. So this war was, for a family that was, even for a family that was having the kind of trouble that Holling's family is having, they were still together on watching these Marines in danger. My sister sat rigid with anger, I guess. She probably wanted to say something like, "I told you so," or "if President Johnson had listened and gotten us out of there in time," or "no one in Washington knows what he's doing." But she didn't. When 500 mortar shells are coming in every day on top of soldiers, huddled in holes with their hands over their ears, even a flower child who wanted nothing but world peace could only watch and hope. I also was watching the newscasts and hoping for a sign, any sign of Lieutenant Tybalt Baker. There never was one, not in any of the films of the mortars or the trenches or the downed and burning helicopters or the wounded. Walter Cronkite didn't read off the names of the missing in action, so Lieutenant Baker was never mentioned, but I still watched anyway, holding my breath, hoping, which is what I think the whole town was doing, which is certainly what Mrs. Baker was doing. But you would have never been able to tell that she was holding her breath at Camillo Junior High. She moved through our classroom as coolly as if Khe Sanh were just a proper noun in a sentence that needed to be diagrammed. Simile. It was early spring and we were her garden, and she was starting to see the bulbs and seeds that she had planted in us last fall coming up. She raked away our dead leaves, spaded new soil around us, and watered and fertilized. And we grew fast and green, let me tell you, especially my T, who was now the best sentence diagrammer in the 7th grade, which may not sound like much, but with Mrs. Baker, it was a big deal. I think that's important to note because if you go back to when Mrs. Biggio's husband died, Mrs. Biggio treated my T poorly, and still is. Although we can see that she's having trouble with it. Mrs. Baker, on the other hand, even though her husband's missing, is not only treating my T the same way she always has, but is almost putting more energy into my T, which, again, the sign of not only a good teacher, but just a good person. During class, it didn't seem as if anything was bothering Mrs. Baker at all. True or false? Except maybe the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, which now had about as much bulge as asbestos ceiling tiles can take. They looked like sails in a full breeze. We didn't know exactly what was making them so heavy. Maybe the rats were hoarding supplies for the summer drought up there. Maybe Sycorax and Caliban were just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But whatever it was, no one wanted those tiles to come down with whatever was bulging them out. Not even Danny Hupfer. Which was why on the first Wednesday afternoon in March, while Mrs. Baker was grading and I was at my desk starting in on Julius Caesar, who, let me tell you, was a whole lot smarter than Romeo, even though he ended up pretty badly too. Mr. Van Larry came in with a ladder, 8 new asbestos ceiling tiles, and a heavy mallet. Mrs. Baker looked at him. "A mallet?" she said. He brandished it in the air like Julius Caesar himself. "You don't know how big a rat on the loose can get in 5 months," he said. Mrs. Baker looked up at the bulging ceiling tiles. "I have an idea. I have some idea," she said. Mr. Van Larry set his ladder under one of the bulges. He steadied it and grabbed his mallet tightly in his right hand. He took 3 steps up the ladder. Then, with his left hand, he slowly reached up to one of the bulging tiles. He tapped it a couple times, and we listened. Nothing. He pushed against it. Nothing. He hit it lightly with the mallet. Still nothing. He came back down the ladder and went over to the corner of the room. He picked up the trash can and came back to the front of the ladder. "I'll need someone to hold this underneath the tile while I take it off, just in case stuff comes out," he said. "Just in case stuff comes out?" said Mrs. Baker. "That's right," said Mr. Van Larry. Mrs. Baker looked over at me. Sometimes I think she still hates my guts. So there I was, holding this trash can underneath the 8 bulging asbestos ceiling tiles, and Mr. Van Larry starting to push up on one of them with his mallet. "You won't catch the stuff standing over there," he said to me. I moved a little closer. "Right there," he said, pointing to the target area. Then he turned and lifted one of the ceiling tiles with his mallet. We listened for the scrambling of 2 rats. Nothing. So Mr. Van Larry tilted the tile to get it out, and shredded everything came pouring down. Homework announcements, PTA letters home, blue dittos, bazooka bubblegum wrappers, those were from Danny, chewed up number 2 pencils, red and green and black and yellow construction paper, napkins from the cafeteria, part of a black sneaker. This was from Doug Switek, who had been looking for it for a couple of months. An odd picture of me leaping across stage in yellow tights, and scraps of Merrill Lee's Mississippi River and You project. It all came down like wet snow. "Hold the trash can under it," hollered Mr. Van Larry, which is exactly what I was doing, except that the stuff was also falling into my eyes and hair and down the back of my shirt, and I think I must have started screaming because Mrs. Baker came and took the trash can from me. "Maybe you should find a different way to collect the refuse?" she said to Mr. Van Larry, brushing the rat-chewed stuff off of me. By the time Mr. Van Larry brought back a tarp, I had pretty much gotten my shaking under control. He handed me that mallet. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Swing at anything that has yellow teeth," he said. "Oh," I said quietly. I wasn't sure if that was better than having the rat-chewed stuff come down on my head. But even though I started to shake again, I held the mallet over my shoulder ready to strike, which, you have to admit, is not only brave and courageous and true and blue and worthy of Jim Hawkins himself, but also pretty remarkable, considering I still had rat-chewed stuff in my hair and down my back. But we never saw Sycorax or Caliban. Mr. Van Larry replaced the bulging ceiling tiles with 8 new ones and then stepped from the ladder and stood back. "Good as new," he said. "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Baker. "I'm sure," I willed him to say. "I'm sure, I'm sure, I'm sure." "I'm sure," said Mr. Van Larry. "Then," said Mrs. Baker to me, "you may return to Julius Caesar." But let me tell you, it's not easy to read a Shakespeare play when you've just been holding a mallet over your shoulder, ready to swing at anything that has yellow teeth, and Mr. Van Larry is still poking at the other tiles to see if they were bulging too, and knowing that any tile could come crashing to the floor, along with Sycorax and Caliban, and they would not be happy. Let me tell you. I wanted to read Julius Caesar standing on my desk, but that would definitely not have been worthy of Jim Hawkins. When he finally left, Mr. Van Larry told us he'd come check on the new asbestos ceiling tiles tomorrow. "Thank you," said Mrs. Baker. Then she went back to her grading. I wonder if she had wanted to stand on her desk, too. Grading, by the way, is also something that makes it hard to read Shakespeare. When your teacher is covering papers with red ink a few desks away from you, and you know that yours is in the stack and it's probably coming up soon, and that your grasp of non-restrictive clauses might not be all that it should be, it's hard to read anything, even though there was some good stuff in Julius Caesar. "You blocks, you stones, you worse and senseless things." It doesn't have the cut of a Caliban curse, but it's all right. It also didn't help that Mrs. Baker kept wiping at her eyes during her grading. Why? Tell me why she's wiping her eyes while she's grading. She told us that she had a terrible cold, but she hardly needed to tell us. Her eyes were mostly red all the time, and the way she blew her nose could be pretty impressive. Sometimes while sitting at her desk, she just stopped doing whatever she was doing and looked somewhere far away, like she wasn't even in the classroom anymore. It was a terrible cold, and day after day it kept on, and even seemed to be getting worse. Merrill Lee said that she was up to half a box of Kleenex per class, which has got to be some kind of world record. Does she have a cold? Maybe. So when she announced on Friday that members of the school board were coming to our room to observe and evaluate classroom performance by both students and their teacher, she told us in a soggy voice that drowned at the end, but drowning or not, she kept going. She was Mrs. Baker. I love that sentence. I will expect you all to be polite to the school board members. I will expect you to be on your very best behavior. I will expect you to show in an appropriate manner what you have been studying this school year. When are they coming? Asked Marilee. Before I tell you what Mrs. Baker said, I have something else to tell you, because you won't believe what happened otherwise if I don't. When Julius Caesar is coming into Rome, which is a place where very bad things will happen to him, this soothsayer comes up to him to tell him what's going to happen. And this is what he says to Julius Caesar. Beware the Ides of March.
Set on and leave no ceremony out. Who calls?
Let every noise be still. Peace yet again.
Who is it in the press that calls on me? I hear a voice shriller than all the music. Cry, Caesar! Speak. Caesar is turned to hear.
Beware the Ides of March! Beware the Ides of March!
What man is that?
A soothsayer bids you beware the Ides of March.
Set him before me. Let me see his face.
Fellow, come from the throng. Look upon Caesar.
What sayest thou to me now? Speak once again.
Beware the Ides of March.
He is a dreamer. Let us leave him. Pass.
So now I'll tell you what happened after Marilee asked, when are they coming? Beware the Ides of March, I said. And Mrs. Baker looked at me, and her eyes opened a little bit. And without looking away from me, she said to Marilee, a week from today, Ms. Kowalski, which was the Ides of March. You are a soothsayer, Mr. Hoodhood, said Mrs. Baker. Sometimes I scare even myself, I said. So a soothsayer is like someone who can predict the future, someone who has magic. And the soothsayer came to tell Julius Caesar, beware of that day. And of course, the end of Julius Caesar, and this isn't ruining, it is ruining it, but such is life. Julius Caesar dies on the Ides of March. We'll talk about it a ton in this book, so I am ruining it. I am ruining it a little bit, just a little bit, but you'll find out anyway. So, prophecy is not an unalloyed gift, she said. Be careful how you use it, which is a teacher's strategy to get you to look up the word unalloyed, which I did, and it still didn't make much sense. So look it up, unalloyed. But what happened later that day was even weirder. In gym, Coach Quattrini announced that he was planning to form the Camillo Junior High cross-country team. It wouldn't be a regular team since cross-country was a fall sport, but he wanted to start the 7th and 8th graders now so that he could choose a varsity team and have them run over the summer and be ready to begin real competition by September. He expected everybody to try out. Everybody. And to get us started in our training, we would be running 2 miles at tempo. What's that tempo? I asked. Race pace, he said. How bad could that be? I said to Danny. Bad, Danny said. Coach Quattrini had us stretch for 3 minutes, then do 4 short sprints down the length of the gym, and then stretch for another 2 minutes. Afterward, he took us outside to the track where there was a pretty brisk March wind that cut right through my t-shirt. He put us at the starting line, held up his stopwatch, and blew his whistle. Danny was right. Race pace could be bad. I don't know how many times Coach Quattrini used the word faster, but if a word can get worn out and die, this one died like Julius Caesar. Told you. He liked to add words to the front of faster. Words like a whole lot, and can't you go any, and you'd better get, and dang it. He also added words after faster like you wimps, and you slugs, and you dang slugs toward the end. It wouldn't have taken much for him to be able to play Caliban on the Festival Theater stage. Afterward, when we all had our hands on our knees and were trying to suck some air into wherever it wasn't that it needed to get, he reminded us that we all had to try out for the varsity team and promised that tryouts would be a whole lot harder than what we'd just done. Toads, beetles, bats. Now, here's where the weird part comes. Into my head jumped the sentence, tryouts will be in a week, on the Ides of March. And as soon as I thought it, Coach Quattrini said, tryouts will be in a week. And you better be a whole lot faster than this, you dang wimpy slugs. I wondered if somewhere down deep within me, I really was a soothsayer, even if only the first parts of the sentences were the same. I ran over the weekend, not because I was worried that Coach Quattrini would think I was a dang wimpy slug, but because I was pretty sure that if I didn't, I might have something awful happen to me after running at tryout pace on the Ides of March. I ran 3 miles on Saturday and then 4 miles on Sunday afternoon, even though it was the Sabbath and I deserved some time off. I wonder if he likes running? And actually, there was another reason for running over the weekend, an even better reason. My father was mad at my sister. Go figure. Which meant somehow that he was mad at me too. And it was better to be running with my little lungs screaming for air, personification, than be in a house with my father screaming at me. And let me tell you, it wasn't for anything I'd done. Now that he had a new junior high school contract, my father needed to hire someone else in the office as a receptionist for weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings. And since he didn't want to pay anyone much for this, he decided that my sister should do it, and he would pay her $1.35 an hour and not take out any taxes. He announced this at supper on Friday night. I can't, said my sister, while passing the lima beans and not taking any. Of course you can, said my father. It's about time you started a job. I'm already working, said my sister. We looked at her. Who for? My father asked. For Bobby Kennedy, she said. For Bobby Kennedy, said my father. Mr. Goldman is letting us use the back of his bakery for campaign headquarters. Bobby Kennedy, said my father again. Bobby Kennedy is a rich kid from Cape Cod who's never done anything in his whole life. Bobby Kennedy will end the war, end the discrimination that's splitting our country in two, and end the control of the government by a handful of fat, old men. My father, who was not fat and old yet, but who could probably imagine himself that way, started to get a little louder, not a good sign. You might as well go work for that Martin Luther King. Maybe I will. He and Bobby Kennedy are the only ones who care that this country is about to explode. He's a communist. Oh, there's deep political analysis. He's leading a demonstration for striking sanitation workers, so he must be a communist. Now you've got it, said my father. You start working Monday afternoon. I think you can figure out how the rest of that conversation went, and how my mother and I didn't say much, and how we never did make it to dessert, and why it was a healthy thing for me to be running over the weekend, even though I hadn't done a thing. Still, I was glad that Bobby Kennedy was running for president. It was hard every night hearing President Johnson and all of his generals with medals spread all over their chests say how well the war was going and how the enemy was about to give up, and then having CBS News cut to pictures of soldiers who were wading through rice paddies and holding their rifles high above the water, or who were carrying out a buddy whose face was covered with dried blood, or who were huddled in holes and covering their heads as the mortars came over in Khe Sanh. After that, you just wanted someone to say the plain truth. And maybe Bobby Kennedy would be that someone. I was glad he was running for president.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man,
but to propose new policies.
I run because I am convinced that this country is on a perilous course.
And because I have such strong feelings about what must be done, and I feel obliged to do all that I can.
I run to seek new policies
Policies to end the bloodshed in Vietnam and in our cities. Policies to close the gaps that now exist between black and white.
Between rich and poor.
Between young and old. In this country and around the rest of the world.
I run for the presidency because I want
the United States of America to stand for hope instead of despair, for reconciliation of men
instead of the growing risk of world war.
I run because it is now unmistakably clear
that we can change these disastrous, divisive policies only by changing the men who are now making them.
The crisis in our cities,
crisis in our farms, and in our ghettos have all been met with too little and too late.
No one who knows what I know about the extraordinary demands of the presidency can be certain that any mortal can adequately fill that position.
I have seen the inexcusable and the ugly deprivation which causes children to starve in Mississippi.
Black citizens to riot in Watts, young Indians to commit suicide on their reservations.
Because they've lacked all hope, and they feel they have no future.
And proud and able-bodied families to wait out their lives in empty idleness in eastern Kentucky.
I've traveled and I have listened to the young people of our nation.
And felt their anger about the war that they are sent to fight.
And about the world that they are about to inherit.
I cannot stand aside.
I cannot stand aside.
I cannot stand aside.
I cannot stand aside.
Stand aside.
I cannot 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 stand aside
from the contest that will decide our nation's future
and our children's future.
I do not lightly dismiss the dangers and the difficulties.
These are not ordinary times, and this is not an ordinary election.
At stake is not simply the leadership of our body, but even our country. It is our right to the moral leadership of this planet.
And so maybe, after all, I had done something to make my father mad, just not out loud. And we're going to stop there. You can see that he's not standing up to his dad, even though he wants to. And this battle that he's having with his, he's having with his sister, and the battle that his sister is having with his father is bad, and she gets to come and be a receptionist, while in the meantime he is the one who's taking over. So very, very interesting. All right, I hope you enjoyed the Bobby Kennedy stuff. I hope that you enjoyed the stuff on Khe Sanh. 1968 was an extremely explosive year, and as complicated as it is in 2020, I think that 1968 certainly is comparable, if not worse. All right, on to the end of March. I don't think we're gonna finish it, but we'll get close. All right, on to the next. Peace.
Now I'm waiting for Wednesday. You're back from out of town. The West is dry, your mind is clear. Well,